coming today. Howdy. What I want to talk about is when you've got a marketplace and a lot of competitors raise a lot more money than you do, and what that's like. So I'm Mark. I'm the founder and CEO of a company called SpotHero, and we are a marketplace which brings drivers and parking spots together. We play in the $30 billion parking market, and we've got 2 million parking spaces with 1,000 parking companies in 108 cities in North America. I guess we don't have the slides. Okay. We'll get there. As I mentioned, $30 billion parking market, pretty old school. Even today, about 30% is actually still cash, if you could believe that. So I want to go back to when there was a couple hundred different parking apps that were our competitors, and we focused on liquidity over geography. And this was really hard because at the time, the prevailing winds in the echo chambers of the valley and everywhere was it's a land grab, you got to get there first. And now looking back at the corpses of many marketplaces, full stack and non-full stack, it's easy in hindsight. But at the time it was really, it was a lot of pressure on us, and it was uncomfortable for me when we were called a one-hit wonder because we were only in one city, but then we went to our second city and then our third city. And so in terms of liquidity over geography, we focused on pairing the supply demand, not just on a city by city, but neighborhood by neighborhood, garage by garage. And once we were able to figure out a very complex playbook in a single geography, or Chicago, then we went to DC, then we went to New York, then we went to San Francisco, and I'm going to talk more about San Francisco. But we were in 5 cities, whereas everyone else was in hundreds of cities. And even to this day, we sell more parking in one city than our nearest competitor does in 150 cities. And we actually today sell more parking than every other parking app combined. And so the power of network effects and actually achieving liquidity in a marketplace is really key for us. Here's an example where, like, and I'm going to use Chicago because that's where we're based. We're in 108 cities, and actually San Francisco is one of our largest. But we basically had as many use cases as possible. And so when a lot of our competitors would brag about having all these cities, if you're in Boston, you don't care how many locations are in San Francisco. And if you're in San Francisco, you don't necessarily care how many locations are in Seattle. Number 2, know thy customer, and also the customer behavior. Parking Panda, here's a company we actually bought, but we went head to head for a long time. And they did something interesting where they achieved liquidity on a customer and garage basis in the event space. Now, this was important for them because they were able to achieve early success. And they had really strong revenue growth because of the liquidity they achieved in the event parking market. The problem, though, was that the purchase frequency of an event customer is 1.1 times a year. So we actually focused on the daily driver in the downtowns. It was much harder to achieve liquidity because the behaviors were not as aggregated. If you've got one event, you know people in one area going to one specific event. Whereas if there's a garage by the Embarcadero, the Impark one over here, you don't necessarily know which building they're going to. So a lot harder to achieve liquidity. But when we did, we were able to have a purchase frequency that was a lot higher. So even though we had the same number of customers, we were 10 times their size. And then we bought them, and it was nice. Unit economics, supply density is also nice. This is kind of the liquidity over geography. If you have a lot of geographies with no liquidity, it's just a leaky bucket, and it's just a hole that kind of, doesn't get filled. And so, if you look at this, you could see our CAC, in certain markets have actually come down. Chicago, we just spend up, and then it's come down. But as we have acquired more users, we're actually acquiring them for less. And I've sat with, we have a lot of great VCs, and we've talked to both internal and external, and it takes a long time, but the network effects can be powerful because usually the prevailing notion is CAC just goes up over time no matter what, and that's usually the case. And we have seen that in certain channels. But what we've seen is when you can achieve liquidity in a specific geography, you can acquire more customers at a lower cost. And that's what we're starting to experience. Next tactic, chicken before the egg. So supply is what we had to start with. And in addition to the customer behavior in a specific geography, when we were just in one city versus 100, all of our marketing dollars, all of our efforts for supply and everything were concentrated with one place. And what that meant is when we worked with some of the largest parking companies, we also work with ones that just have one, we were bringing so much revenue in one city that all the large ones were like, wow, we have to expand. This is important and relevant. And we actually rose to the highest levels of management within these large companies, and nobody else did. And the reason is we were only in one city, so it's kind of counterintuitive. All these other ones had scale, but these parking companies are like, yeah, but they bring us vapor amounts of revenue in 100 or 200 cities, whereas you guys are in one city and bring us all of this. So they started extrapolating. And so that also helped. And this is actually a graph of our retention from our facility. So when a facility comes on, this is 33 months of data. And you have the cohorts by quarter. 12 months later, we're doing 275% more revenue. And then you do that, if you fast forward again, we're doing 500%, and it goes up from there. Next, build a competitive moat. So we aggregated as many pieces of the puzzle so that we could actually not have a wedge for anybody else to come in. Okay. And so we've talked about supply demand, and this ecosystem is super complex. I'm going to talk about something very obscure but very beneficial to us. That was the tow truck app. So we built an app, which no one really knows about this, and I don't think we've ever talked about it publicly, where there's thousands of tow truck drivers that actually have it. And it's a very simple app which says this set of license plates can park here now. And that enabled us to help move a lot of the offline industry online. And we're the only ones that enabled thousands of locations to be mobile enabled, because you had the enforcement was from a tow truck driver, whereas everyone else had to have a piece of paper printed out. And so each piece of the ecosystem to increase the customer experience, to have a competitive moat, we built integrations into the accounting systems to further align ourselves with these companies. We integrated with all the point of sale systems. Obviously, you can't do everything, and in a marketplace, it's hard to prioritize. But what we started with is we started with supply, and then we did demand, and then we made the experience better for our demand, and then we made the experience better for our supply. And then beyond that, we started taking it to the next level with the point of sale systems. But there was an order to it to not just be excited about revenue growth, but be thinking about revenue moat. Business development better than VC. So I don't know how many people remember the Ondemand valet. Who here has used Ondemand valet or heard of it? Okay, enough people. Well, for those of you that don't, it was a set of companies that raised money to basically valet cars where you could press a button and have your car whisked away, and then you could get it back. Super exciting customer experience. However, very difficult to accomplish. And today, actually, all those companies have shut down that service. However, at the time, we had raised $4 million. And it was really kind of a scary situation when we've raised $4 million and we have companies that have raised 5, 10. And I was like, man, I made a joke. Ezra was there. I'm like, they've raised $10 million. They certainly can't raise 20. And then it was 20, 30, 40, 50. And I was like, they can't raise 60. There was like 60. And then Lux ended up raising $77 million. And half the growth funds in the Valley had invested in this area. And so it was very tough for us. Existentially, as I was being told, hey, Mark, you're being disrupted before you have a chance to be actually disrupt. And I'm like, yeah, but this doesn't make sense. And I was like having that existential crisis of, am I like the parking folks who said, I don't believe in the internet and you're wrong? Like because I've been told nobody's going to buy parking on a telephone. And I'm like, but they do already. And it's like, that's a thing. And so it's kind of hard. I'm like, and I'm torn. Am I that person that is just against this new thing because of my biases? But we actually dug into this heavily and realized that the model fights with itself, both financially and operationally, with a negative gross margin business that you cannot dig out of. And we spent a lot of research. I spun up a on-demand valet company in stealth in New York and Chicago. We tested every single thing, even though every bone in my body was against the idea of this even being remotely successful. But what was interesting is there was a time when Hertz invested $50 million into Lux Valet. And this was, really worrisome for us as there were mobility ecosystems that were forming. And the fact that like Hertz had made such a big bet, and they had just done a deal with Uber, it was kind of like, how do we combat this? And so we, had to think about a lot of things tactically around how CACs blow up. How do we use the leverage of density to compete with overfunded competitors? But also, we had heard rumors about what was happening with Lux. And so in the same way, when we went head to head, so we're in Chicago, we went head to head with a company called Parkwiz that had a 5-year head start on us, beat them in Chicago. We then went head to head in DC, and we leveraged all the techs I talked about to go against Parking Panda. And then we went to New York to go head to head with a company called Best Parking. Conquer and hold, conquer and hold, conquer and hold. And then in San Francisco, we actually, because of these companies, launched San Francisco 5 cities sooner than we otherwise would have. Because as I was told, not only do you have no money, Mark, but you're not able to even use you in San Francisco, so you're invisible, and the VCs don't care unless they can, so you can use you. So we launched in San Francisco, and we also leveraged our networks to get into Hertz. And this is actually something that I've never talked publicly about before. But as we had rumors that Hertz was writing a $50 million check, I was sitting in Estero, Florida, which is where Hertz is based, with the CEO and the CRO of Hertz to talk about a commercial deal. So what was interesting is even though they put $50 million into Lux, who's in the Hertz app? SpotHero. So if you look at the Hertz app, and this was like they announced $50 million bucks, and SpotHero was in the Hertz app and had an announcement right around the same time. So we were like, how do we kind of, use other strengths if we don't have the money to combat some of the stuff in the echo chamber? Well, that leads to media validation in addition to BD. So every day there was an article written about On-Demand Valet. It is the best thing in the world. The universe will be forever changed because On-Demand Valet exists. And, air smells sweeter, food tastes better because On-Demand Valet is here. And then I was told, oh my God, Mark, it's crazy. You should do On-Demand Valet. Like every time, because it's free marketing. There's just people everywhere. And it was a tough slog for that 2 years. So, I actually spent a week in San Francisco only talking to journalists. And I'd spent a couple weeks preparing for those talking points. And then I did the same thing in New York and I did the same thing in LA to literally talk through a deep dive of high-level motifs and tactical things around. And we showed them spreadsheets around like yes, it's cheaper when you have the car farther away, but guess what? Now you increase the likelihood of it getting into an accident, the time it takes from traffic to get back. We talked about the customer experience, the gross margins. We spent so much time trying to educate and change without coming off as defensive, which is really tough to do. Because I've been told, Mark, why are you being so defensive? Like when you're talking to someone, like you just seem so defensive. Is this because you're being disrupted and like your company's going out of business? Well, no, they're going to go out of business. Can I quote you on that? It's like, but these are some real articles that started to trickle in as things started to change, which was SpotHero launches its parking app in SF, and On-Demand Valet startup should worry. When that hit, that was like the first little bit of vindication. I was like, oh my gosh, this is the first time where an article was written not about how On-Demand Valet is going to change the universe. And it wasn't accidental. It was a ton of work, an unimaginable amount of work. So this is what's worked for us. That doesn't mean it's necessarily going to work for you, but creativity and the marketplace, to win is important because once you do burst through certain areas in a marketplace, the moat is one of the greatest that can be. Park ADM. Thank you. I think we have a few minutes for questions. Does anyone have any questions? Yes.
On your slide we were talking about supply, demand, and seamless acquisition. In our company, we get a lot of signals that we could acquire greater demand if only we integrated with QuickBooks or the POS systems for the retailers that we work with, and we have a business-to-business marketplace. And so we're getting all these signals while we're still trying to acquire demand. We've got supply covered. At what point do you decide when to start seeking out these integration partnerships? Do you do these things simultaneously? Do you really stage it out one step to the next? How do you really make that decision?
I mean, I think it's going to be different for every marketplace. I can tell you what worked for us specifically, because I don't know enough about your business, or I don't know about your business. But what we did is we were like, we don't care about the we just want to move fast. So we were also kind of shut out of these like point of sale systems. So like, I don't know if QuickBooks is willing to talk with you and it's like a dev resource or prioritization issue, but I'll tell you what, the parking point of sale systems company told us every single one fly a kite, but in not as nice words. Yeah. And so we didn't have an option. And so what we did is we focused on bringing customers, and the experience was really bad in the beginning. So much so that I actually, because I was customer service, I was you call a Google Voice, hello, this is Mark from SpotHero. Like, hey, I just parked at an ABM lot, which, by the way, that's the second largest parking company in the country and publicly traded. And so on your parking pass, which is a printed piece of paper, do you guys have an app? No, we don't have an app yet. Why don't you have an app? Oh, well, we're going to have an app. You should have an app. Yeah, I know we should have an app. It says that I push a button, and then when I pushed the button, I had to wait, and someone ran, and they were sweating. And they then took some big kind of like key-like thing and put it into a box and opened it and lifted the gate. And he said he ran from 3 blocks away. That can't be how your product actually works. And I'm like, I should look into that. And so, the parking company was unwilling to make the investment. The integration, point of sales wouldn't talk to us. And it wasn't until we threw enough revenue and enough people where the attendant's like, I'm going to have a heart attack. Customers were getting upset, and there was enough revenue to justify putting a scanner, and then it ultimately went to license plate recognition. So at that same garage, when you drive today, it'll actually scan your license plate and let you in. But if we didn't send demand to a not so good experience, we would have never gotten there. So there's no right or wrong answer. Marketplaces are really tough, and I don't know enough about your business in terms of prioritization or how it works, but that's kind of how it worked for us.
Sure. Thanks.
Yep. Yes.
You mentioned a little bit about chicken before the egg and a lot of it about density. Right now we have a business model where we have like nationwide acquisition and some local acquisition, particularly to fund the investment needed in the product and investment in the back office and the ops and stuff like that. In the early days, how did you guys balance the fixed costs of building everything with kind of the lower, maybe the higher acquisition costs of going dense first?
So if you have an ability to acquire costs lower nationally, like that's interesting. We never had a channel where we could acquire customers cheaper than in a city. So it was harder to acquire them on a geography versus nationally, but it was always cheaper for us. So that's an interesting dynamic. And if you're able to do that nationally, I think that's a lot different than what we experienced.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
On the topic of channels, can you share a little bit about what you learned about the kinds of channels that made sense on supply and on demand, and some things you saw that didn't make sense from a channel perspective?
Yeah, I think with supply, there's no one channel. I mean, we went up, we went down, we went in the middle. We went to parking conferences. We showed up in person. I mean, we had just crazy whatever tactics there. A lot of it was just kind of like, relationship driven and time and creativity. But from a customer acquisition, I mean, SEM was one, SEO, a lot of the ones that are, natural. One thing that was interesting though for us is terrestrial radio. And so the CAC was actually twice as high for terrestrial radio. Now it's actually lower than SEM, if you could believe that. But the behavior of the customers, the LTV was in some cases 5 times higher. And so, I was getting questions from our competitors, why are you burning all this money on radio? The CAC's so high. And I was like, I don't know. I like high CAC. And where are they now?
So on the supply side, it sounds like you guys just had to grind it out. Are the things you figured out over time that make more sense than others?
Yeah, there's things that help accelerate it. Like if you're able to, if you have materials, you can point to something. Like we have a whole sales process, and like things have sped up, and they're more at scale. But the earliest things that we did were really about like, how do you understand what their needs are, and how do you communicate in their language? And that was very effective for us in an industry where when like $500 million went to fund on-demand valet, and the valet type notion of like, hey, I have more money than SpotHero in the parking industry. They're like, well, I have more money than you. Right. And they don't like when other people have the possibility of making more money. So that made them kind of scared. And a lot of people didn't want to work with them. So understanding the language, the communication of the industry, ours is very, very specific. But yeah, we just grinded it out, and it's easier to grind it out in a single kind of, and again, for us, it was a geography in a marketplace. Another type of industry, it could be a segment, right? Like it might be all geographies, one segment, right? The question is which piece of the model, value chain, segment should be focused on. Just because we did well focusing on a geography, that's specific to our marketplace, and it might not be specific to yours.
How did you sort of marry your micro geography knowledge with your sales team? If you're in Halstead in Chicago and you don't know that garage the best,
Mm-hmm.
Diversity is shit.
You're from Chicago, huh?
I just throwing things
Yeah.
out. How do you make sure your sales team's going after the right one versus the one that's actually returning for you?
Well, in the earliest days, like it was just myself and my co-founder, and like we had like one other person, and so it was very easy to kind of figure that out. Now, I mean, we have a 8-person data team. Everything's in Looker. There's like points. I mean, it's like this garage at this corner at this time of day at this hour for this price, right? You get that, you're good. Like we are exceptionally specific, and there's like lists of garages we don't want. There's equipment we won't work with. There's customer experiences we won't accept. I mean, now it's like a much more organized machine that is led by like a sales leader. One of them is right here. Nate runs our whole West Coast out of San Francisco, and Chris works with them here in a number of different markets. And like their knowledge and who they work with, and you guys have someone on the ground in LA and Seattle. So it really depends on the stage of the marketplace. I think we have time for one more. Yes. Hey, Kevin.
It looked like you had a pretty big watershed moment on some of these CACs
Mm-hmm.
that came down. You said network effect.
Mm-hmm.
I was just wondering if you could unpack that a little bit. Like, was it supply? Was it some of the BD stuff with like a Hertz or
Yep.
a Waze?
Yep.
Did they show up? Was it brand recognition? What led to that? Because you don't see that very often.
Yeah, so I would say, I wish I could say like one thing. So I'll tell you what it's not. It wasn't from the BD stuff in terms of driving down that. However, that will be probably the biggest lever in the back half of this year. The drivers though, and again, I wish it was like one thing, because then we could just hit that one thing, but it's the customer experience. And so over the past year, we've integrated with the point of sale systems where we have access to get a car in and out. And the reason that helps from like a acquisition the whole unit economics of like a city is because when someone's able to get in and out easier versus like pressing a button or even scanning, but like license plate versus handing your phone to a tenant, but like that seamless experience, you're going to buy more frequently, but bigger than that, you're going to tell more people. And what we've seen is as we've spent more paid, it's more efficient for the word of mouth as we acquire more word of mouth. And density is probably the biggest. As we've gotten more density, the conversion rate goes up. And so you might look in San Francisco, and if we didn't have a specific garage, or even if we had the garage but we didn't have enough inventory, or we had it but you wanted it for an hour longer than we were, and you wouldn't buy. But by having as much breadth from a density perspective, density and the customer experience are like the two biggest things. But the Hertz stuff, Waze, that will be a big accelerant. But just from like the unit economics on the city, it's those things. Yep. Good to see you. All right. Thank you.